In 1989, it took a solar storm about 90 seconds to switch off the entire province of Quebec and drop 6 million people into the dark. And that storm was only a fraction of what our sun is capable of. Over the last several days, our star has been firing again. An X-class flare, a dozen more behind it, a radio blackout washing across half the planet, all while it is supposedly winding down toward its quiet years. The machines that keep your lights on are older and more fragile now than they have been in decades. And the sun has just reminded us that it has not stopped loading the chamber. So what really happens inside a power grid when the current from the sky comes pouring in, and why do the people who study this quietly fear the day the aim finally turns true? If the forces above our heads fascinate you the way they fascinate me, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Sky Lab, where we follow the storms overhead and the stories behind them, and tell me in the comments, has the power ever gone out where you live, and how long did it last? Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The star that refuses to settle. The sun is supposed to be calming down right now. Nobody appears to have told the sun. Over the last several days, our star has done something that has quietly put the people whose job is to watch it on edge. In a single stretch of about 24 hours, it fired off one X-class flare, the most powerful category of flare we have a name for, and then it fired 12 more in the tier just below, one after another, like a machine that could not find its own off switch. It threw out a pulse of X-rays strong enough to black out high-frequency radio across the entire sunlit half of the planet for the better part of an hour. And it drove a geomagnetic storm that climbed to the level forecasters call strong, high enough to drag the northern lights down toward the middle of the map and to make the engineers who keep our power systems running glance a little more often at their screens. Any one of those things on its own would be an unremarkable few days on an active sun. All of them stacked into the same day, at this particular moment in the cycle, is the part that should make you sit up. Because right now, by every measure we use, this sun is not supposed to be capable of a performance like this. Here is what I mean. The sun runs on a rhythm, a roughly 11-year heartbeat that carries it from quiet to violent and back again. We call the violent peak solar maximum, and we passed it. The number of sunspots on the surface, which is the simplest scorecard we have for how wound up the star is, has been falling. Last month, the count came in at 94, down more than 20 from where it stood a year earlier. On paper, the sun is winding down, packing up, heading for the quiet years, and yet last night it reached out and fired an X-class flare anyway, and a dozen more behind it, as if it had never read the forecast about its own retirement. That contradiction is not a mistake in the data. It is one of the genuinely unsettling truths about the star we live next to. The sun does not save its worst behaviour for the top of the cycle. Some of the most violent, most beautifully organised eruptions in the historical record came not at the roaring peak, but on the long slope down, when everyone assumed the danger had passed. The decline is not the same thing as safety. If anything, the decline is when the sun likes to remind us that averages are just averages, and that a single bad day does not care what the yearly trend is doing. Now, I want to be honest with you right at the start because this channel does not trade in panic. The specific flare that lit up the sky yesterday sent its cloud of plasma, its coronal mass ejection, off on a path that misses us. Analysis put that cloud on a track passing behind Earth's orbit, so from that particular shot nothing is coming for us. And the geomagnetic storm that peaked yesterday morning is already fading, sliding back down toward quiet as I speak. If you were waiting for me to tell you that the lights are about to go out tonight, I am not going to tell you that because it would not be true. But that is exactly the point, and I need you to sit with it for a second, because it is the whole reason we are here. The danger was never this storm. The danger is the pattern this storm is part of. The danger is a star that keeps firing, keeps loading the chamber, keeps aiming in our general direction, at a time when the thing it is aimed at has quietly become more fragile than it has been in the lifetime of almost anyone watching. And what is it aimed at? Not you exactly, not your house, not your body. The sun has been throwing this kind of radiation and plasma at the Earth for 4.5 billion years, and life has done just fine. What is different now, what has only been true for a little more than a century, is that we built something in between. We wired the entire surface of our civilization together with copper and steel. We strung long metal lines across whole continents and hung enormous machines on them, machines the size of houses, and we made every single thing we do, every light, every hospital, every water pump, every gas station, every phone in every pocket, depend on those lines staying up. We built an enormous, delicate antenna and pointed it at the sky. And the sun, which does not know or care that we did this, has spent the last few days demonstrating that it can still hit that antenna hard. So the story I want to tell you is a collision, one that has not happened yet in its full form but that grows a little more likely every year. It is the collision between a sun that will not stop firing and a power grid that has never been more exposed to what the sun fires. And to understand why that collision would matter so much, why a good aurora in the sky can also mean a dead transformer on the ground, we have to understand both halves of it. We have to understand what the sun is actually doing up there right now, in the plain language of what these numbers mean. And we have to understand the strange, invisible, almost forgotten machinery that keeps the modern world lit, and why it is so much more brittle today than it was even 20 years ago. Let me start with the sun, because the sun is where the trouble begins, and because what it did over the last few days is genuinely a little strange. The X-class flare, the big one, came from a fresh patch of magnetism that had just rotated into view around the eastern edge of the sun. Forecasters gave it a number, 4,482, and it announced itself with a flare rated X 1.3. If you have never had a reason to learn the flare scale, here is all you need. Flares come in letters, and each letter up is 10 times more powerful than the last, the way each step on the earthquake scale is a giant leap rather than a small one. C is common and mostly harmless. M is moderate, the kind that can rattle radio and radiation. X is the top of the ladder, the class we actually worry about. And this was an X 1.3, comfortably into that top tier. What came with it is the part that caught my attention. That flare launched a shockwave through the sun's outer atmosphere, moving at more than 2,700 kilometers every second. Let that speed land for a moment. In the time it takes you to say the word out loud, that shock front crossed a distance greater than the width of the United States. This is not a gentle star having a gentle retirement. This is a star that, even on the downslope of its cycle, can still crack a whip across its own surface at millions of miles an hour. And that single X-flare was not alone. In the same day, a second, older patch of magnetism near the opposite edge of the sun, a much larger and nastier tangle of fields, threw off 10 separate M-class flares of its own, plus a scatter of smaller ones, keeping the sun's X-ray output elevated hour after hour. This region was the real workhorse of the last few days, a knotted, twisted mess of magnetism that forecasters flagged as carrying the most dangerous magnetic arrangement a sunspot group can have, the kind that stores enormous energy in twisted field lines and releases it in sudden, violent snaps. On the day we are talking about, that one region alone was rated with a 6 in 10 chance of another M-flare and a 1 in 10 chance of another X, and it spent the day making good on those odds. So put the picture together. One brand new region firing an X-flare and a shockwave off one edge of the sun. One old, complex, dangerous region hammering out M-flare after M-flare off the other edge. A radio blackout washing over the daylight side of Earth. And a geomagnetic storm driven by clouds of plasma the sun had hurled at us days earlier, ringing the planet's magnetic field like a bell. All of it at once. All of it during the years the sun is supposed to be growing quiet. The forecasters will tell you correctly that both of those big regions are now rotating toward the far edge of the sun and will soon turn away from us, and that activity should dip over the next couple of days as they go. That is true. But notice what that reassurance quietly admits. It admits that the danger from any given region is a matter of where it happens to be pointing. A monster on the far side of the sun cannot hurt us. The same monster, rotated a week earlier, aimed straight down the 93 million mile line between the sun and the Earth, is a very different sentence. The sun did not get less dangerous, it just happened to be aimed slightly to the side. I want to give you a sense of what that run of activity actually felt like to the people whose job is to monitor it, because a dry list of flares does not capture the drumbeat of it. It was not one event and then quiet. It was a flare, and then a few hours later another, and then another, hour after hour, a fresh region on one edge of the sun, and an old dangerous one on the other trading blows, the X-ray monitors on the satellites that watch our star pinned up in the warning zone for the better part of a full day. The radio blackout alone, that stretch when high-frequency radio faded out across the entire daylight side of the planet, is the kind of thing that reroutes aircraft away from the poles and cuts off ships and radio operators in the middle of a sentence, and it is the gentlest of the effects we're going to talk about tonight. In the language of the forecasters, it was a strong event, and it was stacked on top of everything else the sun was doing, and all of it, remember, came from a star the textbooks say should be settling toward its quiet years. Sit with how strange that is for a moment. Picture a fire that is supposedly burning down to embers, and then, without warning, it throws sparks higher than it did at its peak. You would not trust those embers. You would pull your chair back and keep watching them, because a fire that behaves like that has not read the rule about how fires are supposed to die. That is exactly where we stand with the sun right now, watching embers that keep flaring, and the reason it matters has nothing to do with the embers themselves, and everything to do with what sits downwind of them. Because here is the thing we almost never say out loud. In a little over a century, we have quietly become a species that lives inside a machine. Not a house, not a city, a machine, an enormous electrical organism that we plug our entire existence into the moment we are born and unplug only when we die. And that machine has a sky above it, the same sky that has always been there, throwing the same kind of sparks it has always thrown. The only difference, the entire difference, is that the sparks used to fall on an empty field, and now they fall on the machine. And that is the thread I'm going to pull on for the rest of this. Not whether the sun is firing, because it is, and it will keep firing. And it will keep firing long after these particular regions have rotated out of view. The real question is what happens on the day the aim is true, when the chamber is loaded and the barrel is pointed straight at us, and the thing on the receiving end is the most complicated, most interconnected, and quietly most fragile machine our species has ever built. To understand how bad that day could be, you first have to understand why a star that is supposedly calming down can still, without warning, decide to fire the shot that changes everything. And the answer to that is stranger and closer than most people ever realize. Part 2. Why a dying cycle still bites. The most dangerous thing about the sun is not how powerful it is how little warning it gives and how completely it ignores our assumptions about when it is allowed to be dangerous. We like to imagine the solar cycle as a smooth hill. You climb up towards solar maximum, the sunspots pile on, the flares come thick, and then you crest the top and coast gently down the far side into the quiet years, the danger dropping away with every month. It is a comforting picture. It is also wrong in one specific and important way. The number of sunspots does fall on the way down. That part is real. But the ferocity of the individual eruptions does not fall in step with the count. The sun on the decline has fewer active regions, yes, but the ones it does produce can be every bit as violent as anything at the peak, sometimes more so, because the magnetic fields left behind in the later years tend to be old, complex, and badly tangled. That is exactly what we are watching right now. The overall sunspot number is down more than 20 from a year ago. By that scorecard, the sun is fading. But the region that spent yesterday firing M-flare after M-flare was not a faded thing at all. It was a large, sprawling knot of magnetism carrying what specialists call a beta-gamma-delta configuration, and that phrase deserves a plain translation, because it is the closest thing solar physics has to a warning label. Think of a sunspot as a place where the sun's magnetic field has punched up through the surface in a loop, one foot of the loop coming out, the other foot going back in, like a horseshoe magnet stuck through a sheet of paper. A simple, calm sunspot has a tidy arrangement. North on one side, south on the other, the field lines arcing peacefully between them. That kind of spot rarely does much. But sometimes the churning beneath the surface drags those magnetic feet around each other, twisting the loops, winding them tighter and tighter, forcing north and south poles to jam up against each other where they do not belong. A delta region is one where opposite magnetic polarities have been crushed together inside a single dark core. Field lines sheared and wound like a spring compressed past what it wants to hold. That stored twist is energy, enormous amounts of it, and the sun does not release it gently. When those crossed field lines finally snap and reconnect into a simpler shape, they let go of that energy all at once, and that release is a flare. So a beta-gamma-delta region is, in effect, a loaded spring the size of several Earths, sitting on the surface of the sun, waiting. It does not care that the calendar says the cycle is winding down. It does not know it is supposed to be retiring. It only knows how much twist it is holding, and when the strain crosses the threshold, it fires. That is why the yearly average is such a poor guide to any given day. The average is a story about how many springs there are. It says nothing about how tightly the ones that exist have been wound. And here is the piece of history that should stay with you, the piece that turns this from a physics lecture into something with teeth. Some of the worst space weather ever recorded arrived not at solar maximum, but well down the slope, in years when everyone assumed the show was over. The great storm that lit up telegraph wires in the 1850s, the one we will come back to, did not land at the towering peak of its cycle. The near catastrophe of the summer of 2012, a cloud of plasma that could have rivaled the worst in history, erupted years after that cycle's maximum had passed. The Sun, over and over, has proven that its single most violent act in a given cycle is not scheduled, not predictable from the sunspot count, and perfectly capable of showing up in the quiet years when our guard is down. This is the recurring truth underneath everything I am telling you tonight. A sun that looks like it is fading is not a sun that has stopped being able to fire the shot that matters. Now, you might reasonably ask, if these regions are so dangerous, why am I telling you the current ones are about to rotate out of view and the activity is about to drop? And the answer reveals the strangest and most humbling thing about our situation. Whether a given eruption threatens us at all comes down almost entirely to geometry, to the simple question of which way the sun happened to be facing when it pulled the trigger. The sun rotates. It takes about 27 days to turn once on its axis as seen from Earth, which means any given sunspot region is only pointed at us for a fraction of that time. When a violent region sits near the centre of the sun's disk, facing us squarely, a cloud of plasma it launches comes barreling straight down the line toward Earth. When that same region sits near the edge, the limb, as we say, whatever it fires goes flying off to the side and misses us entirely. It is the difference between a rifle aimed at your chest and the same rifle aimed at the wall 3 feet to your left. Same rifle, same shot, completely different night. That is precisely why the big X-flare from yesterday does not threaten us. It came from a region right at the eastern edge, just rotating into view, and its plasma cloud went off behind Earth's orbit. And it is why the forecasters can promise the activity will dip, because the workhorse regions are sliding toward the western edge and will soon turn their backs to us. But look closely at what that reassurance is really saying. It is not saying the sun has calmed down. It is saying the sun's guns are currently pointed slightly away from us. Those same regions, those same loaded springs, will spend the next 2 weeks travelling across the far side of the sun, entirely out of our sight, still capable of firing, and then some of them may well rotate right back around to face us again, older and no less dangerous. We have measured this. Over and over in the historical record, a region will fire harmlessly off the limb, rotate out of view, and come back around a month later to unload directly at Earth. The sun is not a single event. It is a rotating barrel of possibilities, and on any given day the only thing standing between us and a direct hit is the accident of which way it is turned. Tonight we are lucky. The aim is off, but luck is not a strategy, and geometry is not a promise. There is one more layer to this, and it is the layer that ties the sun directly to the ground, so hold on to it. When a region is facing us and it launches one of these clouds, we do get some warning that it is coming. Telescopes watching the sun's outer atmosphere can spot the cloud blasting outward and can estimate roughly how fast it is moving and when it might arrive, and that arrival is usually somewhere between a day and 3 days later. So in the broadest sense we can see the punch being thrown. What we cannot see, until the very last moment, is whether the punch will actually connect in the way that hurts. And that last piece of missing information, that final blind spot just minutes wide, is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Because everything that determines whether a solar storm merely paints the sky green or actually reaches down and kills the machines that keep the lights on comes down to a detail we cannot measure until the cloud is almost on top of us. There is something else about these tangled regions that sets them apart from almost every other natural hazard we face, and it is worth naming plainly, because it changes how you should think about the whole threat. We can see a hurricane coming for days. We can watch it spin up over warm water, track its path, measure its strength, and tell people with real confidence when and where it will come ashore. The sun offers us no such courtesy. We can see which regions are dangerous. We can measure how tangled and loaded with energy they are, and we can say that one of them is likely to fire soon. But the exact moment it snaps, the instant those crossed magnetic field lines finally give way and dump their stored energy into space, is beyond our power to predict. It might be in an hour, it might be in 3 days, it might be never, if the region rotates out of view first. We are watching a bomb with no visible timer, holding a fuse whose length we cannot measure. And because the sun turns on its axis, that bomb keeps coming back around. A region that fires harmlessly off the western edge today does not simply cease to exist. It spends roughly 2 weeks travelling across the far side of the sun, completely hidden from us, and if it survives that passage intact, it rotates right back into view to face us again, often still active, sometimes more knotted and dangerous than before. The historical records are full of exactly this pattern, a single troublesome region making 2, 3, even 4 separate passes across the face of the sun over successive months, threatening us anew each time it comes around the edge. The barrel does not empty after one shot. It reloads, and it spins, and we simply wait to see which chamber is under the hammer when it swings our way. Tonight, by luck alone, the loaded chambers are pointed just past us. So we have a star that keeps firing even as it fades, loaded with tangled regions that do not care about the calendar, held back from us tonight only by the accident of its own rotation. That is one half of the collision. It is the trigger. But a trigger is only as dangerous as the thing it is pointed at, and to understand why a well-aimed solar storm has become a genuine threat to the modern world in a way it simply was not 100 years ago, we have to leave the sun behind for a while and come down to Earth. We have to look, really look, at the thing we almost never think about, the enormous, humming, invisible machine that every part of your life silently depends on. Because the reason a solar flare can now threaten a continent has almost nothing to do with the sun getting stronger, and almost everything to do with what we have built and how little of it we have protected. Part 3. The machine nobody thinks about. You have almost certainly never looked at the most important machine in your life, and if you did see it, you would not give it a second glance. It sits behind a chain-link fence on the edge of town, or beside a highway you have driven 1,000 times, a squat grey box the size of a small house, painted the colour of a rainy afternoon, humming to itself in a gravel yard full of insulators and wires. It has no moving parts you can see. It does nothing dramatic. It just hums, and every light in your home, every screen you own, every hospital ventilator and traffic signal and water pump and gas station for 100 miles around, quietly depends on that grey box and a few thousand others exactly like it staying alive. That box is a high-voltage transformer, and it is the single most important, most irreplaceable, and most overlooked object in the entire modern world. Let me back up and lay out the machine as a whole, because most of us carry around only the vaguest picture of where our electricity comes from. It starts at a power plant, where something spins a generator, whether that something is steam from burning gas, water falling through a dam, or wind pushing a blade. That generator produces electricity, but at a voltage far too low to send across a country. Pushing power over long distances at low voltage is like trying to water a distant field through a garden hose. So much is lost to friction along the way that almost nothing arrives. So we do something clever. We use a transformer to step the voltage way, way up, to hundreds of thousands of volts, and at that enormous voltage the power can travel across a continent on those tall steel towers you see marching over the hills, losing very little on the journey. Then, when it arrives near a city, another set of transformers steps the voltage back down stage by stage until it is finally low enough and safe enough to come through the wall and charge your phone. That entire journey, from the plant to your outlet, runs through a network we call the grid, and its scale is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. In the United States alone, it is hundreds of thousands of miles of high-voltage transmission line, tied together through more than 55,000 substations, all of it synchronized, all of it balancing supply against demand from moment to moment, second by second, without ever really stopping. It is often described as the largest and most complex machine ever built, and that is not marketing. It is a single interconnected mechanism spanning a continent, and you are plugged into it right now. But of all the pieces in that immense machine, a small number carry a weight out of all proportion to their number, and those are the big ones, the extra high voltage transformers. These are the giants that handle the highest tiers of the system, 345,000 volts and above, some of them running at 765,000 volts. There are not that many of them, relatively speaking. But they are the choke points through which the whole thing flows, the critical junctions where the power of entire regions is gathered up, transformed, and passed along. And here is the fact that turns this from an engineering tour into a genuine vulnerability. Those giant transformers are individually almost impossible to replace quickly. I want you to really understand why, because this single fact is the hinge of everything that follows. A large power transformer is not a part you order from a warehouse. Each one is custom designed for the exact spot it sits in, built to order for its particular voltage and its particular role. It weighs between 100 and 400 tons. It costs millions of dollars. It is so heavy that moving one often requires a specialized rail car, and there are only a handful of those rail cars in the entire country. And most critically of all, for decades the United States has imported the majority of these giants from overseas, which means that when you need a new one, you're not waiting days. You're waiting months and often more than a year, sometimes closer to 2, for a factory on the other side of the world to build your bespoke, house-sized, hundreds of tons machine and ship it across an ocean. Now hold that number in your mind, that year or 2 of waiting, because it is the number that decides whether a bad day becomes a bad decade. If a storm damages one of these giants, the region it served can usually be patched by rerouting power and leaning on its neighbours. Annoying, expensive, survivable. But if a storm were to damage many of them at once, across a wide area, all at the same time, you would run straight into a wall. You cannot reroute around a hole that big, and you cannot simply replace them, because the world does not keep hundreds of spare house-sized transformers sitting on shelves. They take a year or 2 to build, one at a time, and everyone would be standing in the same line at once. The thing that protects us on an ordinary day, the sheer redundancy of the grid, quietly evaporates when the damage is widespread enough, and what is left is a queue measured in years for machines measured in tons. This is the piece the public almost never hears, and it is the piece that keeps the specialists up at night. It is not that the power might go out. Power goes out all the time, in storms and heat waves and accidents, and we deal with it, because we can put it back within hours or days. The nightmare is different. The nightmare is a blackout that cannot be quickly undone, because the machines that would undo it have themselves been destroyed, and the replacements are a 2-year backorder away. That is the difference between an inconvenience and an emergency that reshapes a region, and the one natural force on this planet capable, in principle, of reaching across an entire continent and damaging many of those giants in a single afternoon is the one we have been watching in the sky. Let me make the scale of this machine a little more concrete, because numbers on their own tend to slide right past us. When engineers call the power grid the largest and most complex machine ever built, they mean something very specific and a little unnerving. Every generator feeding it, from a dam in the mountains to a gas plant on the coast, has to spin in near-perfect lockstep with every other generator across the whole interconnected region, all of them turning in time, 60 cycles a second, matched so precisely that an entire continent behaves like a single spinning object. Supply has to meet demand every instant, because electricity is not stored in any large quantity. It is made and used in the same breath. When you switch on a kettle in your kitchen, somewhere a generator works a hair harder to feed it, right then, in that second. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of people and machines all switching on and off at once, balanced moment by moment, day and night, without a single pause, for decades. That is the machine, and it never stops turning. Now look closer at one of the giants that holds it together, because the more you understand how a large transformer is actually made, the more that 2-year replacement time stops sounding like a bureaucratic delay and starts sounding like a law of nature. Inside that grey steel box are coils of copper, sometimes miles of it, wound with enormous precision around a core built from thousands of thin sheets of special iron, all of it submerged in a bath of insulating oil that keeps it cool and stops the electricity from arcing across the gaps. Every one of these machines is engineered for the exact voltages and loads of the single spot it will occupy. There is no standard model rolling off an assembly line by the thousand. Each is a bespoke build, drawn up, ordered and then constructed over many months in one of a small number of specialized factories, most of them on the other side of the world. When it is finished, this one object weighs as much as a fully loaded airliner, and moving it can require a purpose-built railcar so rare that only a handful exist in the entire country, creeping along special routes at little more than walking pace. This is not a spare part you keep on a shelf. It is closer to a public work, and we have thousands of them quietly holding up everything you do. That is the machine the current from the sky is aimed at, and that is why its size, the very thing that protects it on an ordinary day, becomes its curse on the worst one. So keep the grey box in your mind. Keep the fence, the gravel, the hum. Keep the fact that it took a year to build and would take a year to replace, and that there are only so many, and that everything you do runs through them. Because I have now shown you the target. I have shown you the enormous, delicate, irreplaceable machinery that the modern world balances on, and I have shown you why its strength on an ordinary day, its sprawling web of connections, becomes its weakness on the worst day. What I have not yet shown you is how. How does a burst of plasma launched from a star 93 million miles away actually reach down through space, through the sky, through the ground, and into that humming grey box on the edge of town and do it harm? The answer is a piece of physics so elegant that we put it to work in every generator on Earth, and so unsettling when it's turned against us that it can push a current the sun made directly into a machine that was never built to survive it. Or Part 4, the current from the sky. To understand how something 93 million miles away can reach down and ruin a machine the size of a house, you have to understand one of the most elegant facts in all of physics, and then watch it get turned into a weapon. Nearly 2 centuries ago, a self-taught bookbinder's apprentice named Michael Faraday noticed something that would end up wiring the entire planet. He found that if you move a magnet near a coil of wire, or change a magnetic field around it, an electric current begins to flow in that wire out of nowhere, as if conjured. Nothing touches the wire. No battery is connected. The mere change in the magnetic field pushes the electrons into motion. We call it electromagnetic induction, and it is not some obscure laboratory curiosity. It is the single principle underneath nearly all the electricity you have ever used. Every power plant on Earth is, at bottom, a machine for spinning magnets past coils of wire to induce a current. We generate our entire civilization's power by changing magnetic fields on purpose. Now here is the unsettling turn. If a changing magnetic field can induce a current in a wire in a power plant, then a changing magnetic field can induce a current in any wire anywhere, including the ones we did not intend to be generators, including hundreds of miles of high-voltage transmission lines strung across the countryside. And there is one force capable of changing the magnetic field over an entire continent, all at once, in a matter of minutes. It is the one we started with. It is the sun. Let me walk the chain of cause and effect all the way from the star to the grey box, because when you see it laid out end to end, it stops feeling like a coincidence and starts feeling like a circuit. When one of those clouds of solar plasma, a coronal mass ejection, comes barreling out from the sun and slams into the Earth's magnetic field, it does not pass through us. Our magnetic field catches it, and the collision makes that field shake, compress, and buckle. The whole invisible cocoon that surrounds our planet begins to shudder and heave, and it does so fastest and hardest during the most violent storms. That shuddering is a magnetic field changing rapidly over the entire globe. And by Faraday's 200-year-old rule, a magnetic field changing over the entire globe induces electric fields in anything that conducts, including the rock and the oceans beneath our feet. Those induced electric fields drive currents through the ground, sluggish, planet-scale currents wandering through the crust. And whenever those ground currents encounter a long metal conductor that offers an easier path than the rock, they climb aboard. The high-voltage grid is exactly such a path. Every long transmission line is grounded at each end, tied into the earth through the transformers at the substations, which means the line and the ground together form a giant loop, hundreds of miles across, open to the sky. The current the sun induced in the ground flows up out of the earth, through the grounded connection of one transformer, along the transmission line, and back down into the ground through the transformer at the far end. We built, without ever intending to, a continent-sized antenna for collecting the electrical aftershock of a solar storm, and the collectors, the places where all that stray current is funneled into and out of the Earth, are the very same irreplaceable giants I just described. This induced flow has a name, geomagnetically induced current, and I am going to keep calling it by a simpler description, the current from the sky, because that is what it is. It is a current no generator made, no utility scheduled, no customer requested, conjured out of nothing but a shuddering magnetic field, flowing into the most critical and most fragile machines in the entire system. And it has one particular property that makes it uniquely dangerous, a property I need you to hold on to because it is the key that unlocks the damage. The current from the sky flows in essentially one direction. It does not reverse. It is, for all practical purposes, direct current, slow and steady and one way. And the entire grid, every transformer in it, was designed and built around the absolute assumption that the current flowing through it reverses direction 60 times every second. We will come back to why that one mismatch, direct current where alternating current was expected, is the whole game. Before we do, I want to make something clear, because it explains why this threat is not spread evenly across the world, and why some places should be far more worried than others. The current from the sky is not democratic. It concentrates. It concentrates at high latitudes, up toward the poles, because that is where the storm's electrical activity, the great rivers of current that flow in the upper atmosphere and paint the aurora, come closest to the ground. The higher your latitude, the harder the sky shudders overhead, and it concentrates over certain kinds of rock. Where the ground beneath a power line is soft, wet, conductive sediment, the induced currents can flow happily through the earth and largely ignore the grid. But where the ground is hard, ancient, electrically resistive rock, igneous stone like granite and the old bones of continents, the current cannot easily pass through the earth, so it is forced to find another route, and the copper and steel of the grid is the path of least resistance. It pours into the lines. This is not a theory drawn on a whiteboard. It is written into the map of every serious solar storm. The old hard rock of eastern Canada, the granite spine of New England, the ancient shields under Scandinavia and the United Kingdom. These are the places where solar storms have historically hit the grid hardest, precisely because the rock says no and the wires say yes. If you want to know who is most exposed to the current from the sky, you do not start with who has the most power lines. You start with who has the oldest rock and the highest latitude, and then you look at how long their transmission lines are, because the longer the line, the bigger the loop, and the bigger the loop, the more of the sky's current it gathers. I want to dwell on the strangeness of this for a moment, because it is one of the more unsettling facts about the world we have built. We did not accidentally stumble into a weakness to solar storms. We engineered ourselves into it deliberately by choosing to run our entire civilization on the one physical principle that a solar storm knows how to exploit. Every watt of power in your home arrived because we spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of turning a changing magnetic field into an electric current. We are, as a species, extraordinarily good at this trick. We have simply never found a way to make it work only when we want it to. The same law that lets us light a city from a waterfall lets the sun shove current into a power line, and there is no version of the technology that keeps the one without the other. Our greatest strength and our particular weakness are the same sentence of physics, read forward and then read back. And the loop that current flows through is larger than almost anyone pictures. When the ground beneath a transmission line fills with the slow currents a storm induces, that current does not stay politely in place. It climbs the grounded connection at one substation, runs the full length of the line, hundreds of miles in some cases, and sinks back into the earth at the far end, completing a circuit that is part copper and part planet. The longer the line, the larger that loop, and the larger the loop, the more of the storm's induced push it gathers, the way a bigger sail catches more wind. We built the longest transmission lines in history to move power efficiently across great distances, and in doing so we built the finest possible collectors for the current from the sky. Efficiency, once again, cutting in both directions at once. Where that current chooses to flow is decided by the rock beneath it, which is why the map of solar risk is really a geological map wearing a disguise. Over soft, wet, conductive ground, the induced currents can move through the Earth itself and largely leave the grid alone. but over hard, ancient, electrically stubborn rock, the granite shields that form the old cores of continents, the current cannot pass easily through the ground, so it climbs into the wires instead because the copper offers the easier road. The oldest rock on the planet underlies eastern Canada, the northeastern United States, the highlands of Scandinavia and the United Kingdom, and it is no accident whatsoever that those are the places solar storms have hit the grid hardest. High latitude puts them under the most violent part of the storm. Old rock forces the current up into their wires. Long lines gather more of it still. Layer those three facts on top of one another, and what you have drawn, without meaning to, is a target. So look at what we have assembled. We have a sun that keeps firing, held off from us tonight only by the angle of its own rotation. We have its clouds of plasma slamming into our magnetic field and making the whole planet's magnetism shudder. We have that shudder, by a law discovered nearly 2 centuries ago, inducing a slow, one-way current in the ground. We have that current climbing out of the Earth and into the longest, oldest, highest latitude power lines and funneling itself directly into the giant, irreplaceable, house-sized transformers at the ends of those lines. Every link in that chain is real, measured and understood, and it all leads to a single spot, the inside of one of those grey boxes, where a current the sun made is about to meet a machine that was never ever built to receive it. What happens in the next 90 seconds inside that box is the difference between a beautiful night of northern lights and a region going dark for a very long time, and to see it, we have to go inside the transformer itself. Part 5. 90 seconds. Now we go inside the grey box into the 90 seconds where everything's decided. At the core of every large transformer is a block of specially made iron, and wound around it are the coils of wire that do the actual work. When the alternating current of the grid flows through one coil, it creates a magnetic field in that iron core, and because the current is alternating, swinging back and forth 60 times every second, the magnetic field swings with it, back and forth 60 times a second in a clean and balanced rhythm. That swinging field is what induces the current in the second coil and lets the transformer do its job of changing the voltage. The whole machine is a piece of choreography built around one assumption, an assumption so basic that the entire design takes it for granted, that the magnetic field in the core will swing evenly in both directions and always stay within the amount of magnetism the iron can comfortably hold. Now introduce the current from the sky. It is direct current. It does not swing. It pushes steadily in one direction, and when it flows into the transformer, it adds a constant one-way shove on top of that clean back-and-forth rhythm. Picture a child on a swing, moving evenly forward and back, and now imagine someone walks up and starts pushing gently but constantly in only one direction. The swing no longer moves symmetrically. It gets driven higher and higher on one side until it slams into the frame at the top of its arc. That is exactly what the current from the sky does to the magnetic field inside the core. It shoves the field so far in one direction that, for half of every cycle, the iron is pushed past the maximum amount of magnetism it can hold. We call that saturation, and a saturated core is a core that has run out of room. Here is why that is a catastrophe and not just an inefficiency. When the iron core saturates and can no longer contain the magnetic field being forced into it, that field does not simply vanish. It spills out. It leaks out of the core and into all the surrounding metal that was never meant to carry it. The steel of the tank, the clamps, the structural supports, the copper of the windings themselves. And a changing magnetic field flooding into solid metal does exactly what Faraday told us it would do back in part 4. It induces currents, swirling eddy currents, in that metal. Those stray currents heat the metal, and they can heat it fast, driving hotspots to hundreds of degrees in a matter of minutes, hot enough to char the paper and oil insulation that keeps the machine from short-circuiting, hot enough to cook the windings from the inside. This is how a transformer physically dies. Not in an explosion, usually, but in a quiet, invisible overheating that ruins it from within, a wound that a year-long backorder cannot quickly heal. And while that heating is happening inside the machine, the saturated transformer is also wreaking havoc on the grid around it in 2 ways at once. First, a saturated transformer becomes ravenous. It suddenly demands enormous amounts of what engineers call reactive power, gulping it out of the system and dragging the voltage down across the network. Second, it stops being a clean device. A healthy transformer passes the smooth 60-cycle current through untouched. but a saturated one chops and distorts that current, injecting a spray of what are called harmonics, false electrical frequencies, back into the grid, polluting the clean signal the whole system relies on. Those two effects, the sudden voltage sag and the flood of harmonics, are what turn a single sick transformer into a continental disaster, because the grid is defended by thousands of automatic protective devices, relays and capacitor banks and breakers, whose entire job is to watch for abnormal conditions and instantly disconnect anything that looks dangerous. When those protective devices see the voltage collapsing and the current full of harmonic garbage, many of them do exactly what they were designed to do. They trip, they disconnect, and here is the terrible irony at the center of it. Each device that trips to protect itself dumps its share of the load onto the devices still standing, which pushes them past their limits, so they trip too, dumping their load onto the next ones, and the next, in a chain reaction that can race across an entire region faster than any human being can react. The system does not fail one piece at a time, it unzips. I told you at the start that this was not theoretical, and I want to prove it to you now with the single clearest example we have, because it happened, and it happened faster than almost anyone believed was possible. On a cold night in March of 1989, a solar storm reached the province of Quebec, whose grid is strung across some of the oldest, hardest, most electrically stubborn rock on the planet, the exact conditions that forced the current from the sky up into the wires. The storm hit. The current poured into the transformers. The protective devices began to see the harmonics and the voltage swings, and they began to trip. And from the first sign of trouble to the complete and total collapse of the entire provincial power grid, the whole cascade I just described, start to finish, took about 90 seconds. 90 seconds from a grid running perfectly normally to a grid that was simply gone, leaving around 6 million people in the cold and the dark, some of them for 9 hours or more. 90 seconds. That is less time than it has taken me to describe it to you. That is the speed at which the current from the sky, funneled into those irreplaceable giants, can take down a modern grid, and it is the speed you should keep in mind every time someone tells you the danger is fading because a couple of sunspots are rotating out of view. The mechanism is real. It has run to completion at full scale on a real grid in living memory. The only questions left are how big the storm can get, and how much more fragile the grid has become since that night in 1989, when the machines were younger and fewer things depended on them. Let me linger inside that grey box a little longer, because the way a transformer dies is so counterintuitive that it is worth watching in slow motion. The thing to hold on to is that the iron core has a hard ceiling on how much magnetism it can hold, the way a sponge has a hard ceiling on how much water it can soak up. On a normal day, the alternating current keeps the core swinging comfortably below that ceiling in both directions, never coming close to the limit. The current from the sky changes everything by adding its steady one-way push, shoving the swing so far to one side that, for half of every single cycle, the core slams into its ceiling and saturates. 60 times a second, half the time, the sponge is already full and the water has nowhere left to go. And every time that happens, the magnetism the core can no longer contain comes bursting out into the metal around it, in pulses, 60 times a second, hammering the machine with stray energy it was never built to absorb. That hammering is what does the killing, and it kills in two ways at once. It heats the metal directly, driving hotspots that can char insulation and cook copper in a matter of minutes, and it turns the transformer into a monster on the grid, a machine that suddenly swallows enormous quantities of reactive power, dragging the voltage down for miles around, while spraying distorted, dirty current back into a system that depends on that current staying clean. The protective devices, watching the voltage fall and the current turn to garbage, do the only thing they know how to do. They cut and run, and each one that runs hands its burden to the next, and the collapse races outward across the network. I told you this ran to completion in Quebec in about 90 seconds, and I want to add one detail from that night, because it captures the reach of these storms. The same storm that collapsed the entire province of Quebec that cold March also, at the very same time, damaged a large transformer at a nuclear plant far to the south, in New Jersey, hundreds of miles away, on a completely separate grid. One storm, one moment, reaching into two different power systems in two different countries, and leaving its mark on both. That is the scale we are dealing with. Not a local fault, A continental fingerprint pressed down everywhere at once, but even Quebec was not the beginning. To understand the full size of what the Sun is capable of, and to feel the true weight of the gamble we are running, we have to go back much further than 1989, back before the grid existed at all, back to a night when the Sun fired a shot so enormous it made the wires of a nearly electricity-free world spark and burn, and painted the sky the colour of blood over places that had never seen the northern lights and never should. Because the storm that did that has a name, and everyone who studies this fears it, and the only reason it did not end our civilization is that it arrived 150 years too early to find anything worth breaking. Part 6. The Night the Wires Caught Fire. On the morning of the 1st of September 1859, a young English astronomer named Richard Carrington was doing what he did most clear mornings, projecting an image of the Sun onto a screen and carefully sketching the sunspots when the Sun flashed. 2 brilliant beads of white light erupted over one of the sunspot groups, so bright and so sudden that Carrington at first thought a beam of ordinary sunlight had broken through his equipment. It had not. He was watching, live, one of the most powerful solar flares in recorded history, a release of energy so enormous it was visible in plain white light against the blinding face of the Sun itself, something so rare that in all the centuries since we have only caught a handful like it. Carrington scrambled to fetch a witness, and by the time he returned moments later, the flash was already fading. He had seen it for barely a minute, but the thing that Flash had launched was already on its way. Somewhere around 17 hours later, the cloud of plasma that eruption had hurled toward Earth arrived, and the planet's magnetic field convulsed. What happened next unfolded across a 19th century world that had almost nothing electrical to break, and it is precisely that fact that makes the story so chilling. Because even in a world with no power grid, no transformers, no electronics of any kind, the storm found the one electrical thing humanity had built, and it savaged it. The telegraph, the great new marvel of the age, the thin network of wires that carried Morse code across countries and underseas went berserk. Operators watched sparks leap from their equipment and from the wires. Some received electric shocks. Paper caught fire in a few offices. And in one of the strangest scenes of the whole event, telegraph operators discovered they could disconnect their batteries entirely and keep sending messages. The lines carrying enough current conjured purely by the storm itself to run the system with no power source at all. The current from the sky was writing telegrams, and above them, the sky was on fire. The aurora, normally a polar spectacle reserved for the far north and far south, came pouring down toward the equator, further than anyone alive had ever seen it. It was reported over the Caribbean, over Colombia, over Hawaii, near tropical latitudes that essentially never see such a thing. In the mining camps of the Rocky Mountains, the light was so bright that men got up in the middle of the night and began cooking breakfast, convinced dawn had arrived. Birds started singing. People who had never in their lives seen the northern lights stood in the streets and watched the heavens ripple red and green, some in wonder, many in fear, more than a few convinced they were witnessing the end of the world. We now call it the Carrington event, after the man who happened to be sketching the Sun the morning it began, and it remains the benchmark, the great ruler against which every other solar storm is measured. We are not guessing about how big it was. The storm left physical fingerprints that we can still read today. It drove chemical changes high in the atmosphere that rained down and were locked into the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, leaving a spike in the layers of ancient ice that core samples still show. It left a mark in the growth rings of trees, a signature of the radiation that reached the ground. Every line of evidence points the same way, toward a storm far larger than anything the modern electrical world has ever been tested against. The 1989 storm that took down Quebec in 90 seconds was, by comparison, a fraction of the Carrington event's strength. Now bring it back to the grey box, because this is the whole reason the story matters, and not just a piece of 19th century drama. In 1859, the Carrington storm arrived over a world with almost nothing to lose, a few thousand miles of simple telegraph wire, and that was the entirety of humanity's exposure. The storm sparked and burned what little there was, terrified some people, delighted others, and then it passed, and the world went on almost exactly as before, because the world was not yet plugged in. It was a full-strength blow landing on an empty stage. It was a rehearsal, performed before we had built the theatre. But we have built the theatre now. in the century and a half since Carrington sketched that flash, we have strung hundreds of thousands of miles of high-voltage line across every continent. We have hung thousands of those irreplaceable house-sized transformers on those lines. We have wired every hospital and water plant and food supply and communication system into the same interconnected machine, and we have made every hour of every life depend on it. We took the empty stage that the Carrington event rehearsed on, and we filled it floor to ceiling with the most fragile and most essential machinery our species has ever made. And the sun, which fired a Carrington-class shot in 1859, is the same sun that fired an X-flare last night, the same sun still loaded with tangled, dangerous regions, the same sun that does not know or care what we have built beneath it. I want to slow down on what those telegraph operators actually lived through, because it is the closest thing we have to a first-hand account of the current from the sky reaching into human technology, and it is genuinely eerie to read. Across the northeastern United States and across Europe, operators sat down at their keys that morning to find their instruments possessed. Some machines ran backward, some threw sparks that set the paper tape smouldering. Operators who touched their equipment took shocks strong enough to knock them back from the table, and then came the detail that still stops people cold. In more than one office, the telegraph men discovered that their storm-charged lines carried so much current on their own that they could disconnect their batteries entirely, cut their own power source off completely, and keep sending messages to one another on nothing but the electricity the storm was pouring into the wires. In one exchange, an operator in Boston and an operator in Portland held an entire conversation down a line with the power removed, the words carried purely by the sun. The current from the sky was running the network for them, and over their heads the aurora came down further than any living memory could recall. It was reported over Cuba and the Caribbean, over Hawaii, over Colombia, places that essentially never see the northern lights. In the gold camps of the Rocky Mountains, miners were woken by a glow so bright they assumed morning had broken, and some rose and began cooking breakfast in the dead of night. Sailors and farmers and city dwellers stood in the streets and watched the sky run red and green from one horizon to the other, and their reactions covered the whole range of what people do in the presence of something enormous. Some certain it was a miracle, many certain it was the end of the world. The reason we can be so sure of the raw size of this storm, a century and a half later, is that it did not only write itself into human diaries, it wrote itself into the planet. The flood of particles changed the chemistry high in the atmosphere in a way that eventually settled and froze into the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, leaving a chemical spike that core samples drilled from that ice still carry today. It left a matching mark in the growth rings of trees that were alive that year. The Earth itself kept the receipt, and the receipt says this was a blow far beyond anything the electrical age has ever been asked to survive. And here is the thing that ought to close off the comfortable idea that Carrington was a one-time freak, never to be repeated. It was not the only monster of its kind, not even in the age of records. In May of 1921, a great storm swept the Earth that some analyses estimate approached the scale of Carrington itself, and it arrived over a world that had by then begun to wire itself. It set fire to equipment. A railroad control tower in New York burned. Telegraph and telephone systems across the northeastern United States and across Sweden failed and sparked and, in places, caught flame. The world of 1921 still had very little to lose compared to ours, only the first threads of an electrical web, and the storm found those threads and scorched them, exactly as the storm of 1859 had found the telegraph wires 60 years before. 2 Carrington-scale blows in the span of a single lifetime, both landing on a world that had barely begun to plug itself in. Now run that forward. If the sky can produce a storm of that size roughly every few generations, and it has, then the question is not whether another one is coming. The question is only whether it arrives in a decade when we happen to be ready for it, or a decade when we are not, and whether Earth happens to be standing in its path or safely off to one side when it does. The sun has fired shots of this magnitude before, more than once, within written history, and it will fire them again. The ammunition is not in doubt. Only the aim and the timing and what we have chosen to build beneath the sky when the shot finally comes. So the question that hangs over everything is no longer whether a storm like Carrington is possible. We know it is possible because it happened and the evidence is frozen in the ice. The question is what a storm like that would do now, arriving not over a handful of telegraph wires, but over the filled and crowded theatre of the modern grid. And the unsettling truth is that we do not have to imagine it entirely from scratch, because in the years since Quebec, the sun has taken several more swings at us, some of them connected. One of them, just a few years ago, was very nearly the shot that ends the story, and the only thing that saved us was a matter of days and of pure undeserved luck. Part 7. The Roulette We Keep Winning. Since that night in Quebec, the sun has swung at us again and again, and the record of those swings reads less like a series of accidents and more like a game of roulette we keep, so far happening to win. Quebec in 1989 was the clean, undeniable hit, the one that proved the mechanism at full scale, the 90 seconds that took 6 million people into the dark. But it was not the last time the current from the sky reached down and touched the grid, and the storms that came after it taught us something Quebec alone could not, which is that this threat does not politely stay near the poles, and it does not need to be a full Carrington to do lasting harm. Take the storms of the autumn of 2003, the one space weather forecasters still simply call the Halloween storms. Over a couple of weeks in late October, the sun unloaded a barrage of enormous flares, one of them rated above X17, more than 10 times the strength of the flare that lit up the sky last night. The geomagnetic storms that followed reached the top of the scale. In the Swedish city of Malmö, the grid gave way and about 50,000 people lost power for roughly an hour. That part sounds almost mild, but the more troubling damage happened far to the south, in South Africa, a country nobody had thought of as especially exposed, sitting at a comfortable middle latitude. There, the current from the sky flowed into the national grid and quietly cooked a number of large transformers, and the cruelty of it was that the damage did not all show up at once. Some of those machines limped along, wounded on the inside, and failed in the weeks and months that followed, dying slowly from injuries the storm had inflicted in a single night. It was a lesson that has never left the people who study this. A solar storm does not have to black you out immediately to have already killed you. It can leave the lights on and the death sentence already signed, hidden inside the windings, waiting. That same barrage forced airlines to reroute flights away from the poles, where the radio and radiation conditions had become impossible, and it drove the astronauts aboard the International Space Station to take shelter in the most shielded part of their spacecraft, while the radiation washed over them. This is the range of a single strong storm. It reaches from the transformers in the ground to the pilots in the air, to the astronauts above the atmosphere, all at once. And 2003, for all its fury, was still nowhere near the size of the storm frozen into the Greenland ice. But the swing that should genuinely make your stomach drop is the one that missed, because it is the one that tells you the big one is not a historical curiosity but a live, loaded possibility. On the 23rd of July 2012, the sun launched a coronal mass ejection of staggering size and speed, a cloud of plasma tearing outward at somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 kilometers every second, a genuine Carrington-class monster by every measurement we can make. It ripped straight across the path of Earth's orbit, and we were not there. The Earth, in its endless circle around the sun, had passed through that exact stretch of space about a week earlier and had already moved on. The monster crossed our lane, and our car had gone by. We know precisely how big it was only because of luck within the luck. A spacecraft named for its mission to watch the sun from the side, sitting out in the direction the cloud happened to go, took the full broadside and measured every part of it. When researchers later studied that data and asked what would have happened had the storm left the sun just 1 week earlier, or had Earth been just 1 week behind, the answer came back plainly. It would have rivaled the Carrington event. It would have been the storm we fear, landing on the filled and crowded theatre of the modern grid. And the only thing that stood between us and that day was the accident of orbital timing, a gap of about a week in a dance that takes a year. We did not dodge it because we were ready. We dodged it because we happened not to be standing where the sun was pointing. Even in recent memory, the reminders keep coming. In May of 2024, the strongest geomagnetic storm in more than 20 years swept over the Earth, the first to reach the top of the scale since those Halloween storms of 2003. Millions of people who had never seen the aurora in their lives watched it ripple over their backyards and photographed it on their phones, and for most of them it was purely beautiful. Behind the scenes, though, grid operators across several continents watched the current from the sky flow into their systems, logged the voltage swings, and held their breath. Across the American farm belt, the storm scrambled the precision satellite navigation that modern tractors rely on, and it did so at the worst possible moment, right in the middle of spring planting, costing farmers real time and real money in a single weekend. But the grid itself this time held, it bent, and it did not break. And it is so tempting to take that as reassurance, to say, look, the big modern storm came and the lights stayed on, so perhaps we have been worrying too much. But that is exactly the wrong lesson, and I need you to see why, because it goes to the centre of everything. The storm of 2024 held not because our grid is invincible, but because that storm, for all its beauty, was still well short of a Carrington, and because its magnetic orientation and its timing happened to fall on the merciful side of the dice. Every one of these events, the hit in Quebec, the slow transformer deaths in South Africa, the monster that missed in 2012, the storm the grid survived in 2024, every single one was decided not by how prepared we were, but by how big the storm happened to be and which way it happened to be pointed. We are not winning this roulette because we have loaded the odds in our favour. We are winning it because the ball has not yet landed on the one number that matters. The South African transformers deserve a second look, because they taught the cruelest lesson in this whole subject, the one about delayed death. When that storm swept over in 2003, the damage to the transformers there was not obvious at first. The lights did not go out that night across most of the country. Instead, the current from the sky had reached into those machines and cooked them just enough, degraded their insulation just enough, that they went on working while dying slowly from the inside. And over the following weeks and months, one after another, they failed, some permanently, in a rolling wave of breakdowns whose true cause traced straight back to that one storm. It means you cannot even count your losses on the morning after. A storm can leave your grid apparently whole and standing, with a set of death sentences already signed inside the windings, waiting quietly to be carried out on their own schedule. And then there is the storm of the summer of 2012, the one that ought to be taught in every school, because it is the clearest proof that the big one is not history, but a live coin still spinning in the air. When that Carrington-scale cloud tore across the path of Earth's orbit and found the planet already gone, a spacecraft sitting off to the side took the full force of it and measured everything, the speed, the density, the ferocious southward-pointing magnetic field, every ingredient of catastrophe. Scientists later ran the numbers and asked the simple, chilling question, what if it had left the sun just 1 week earlier? Their answer was published plainly. It would have struck the Earth with the force of the Carrington event, landing not on a world of telegraph wires, but on the modern grid, and we would have spent the years since digging ourselves out from under it. We missed the storm of the century not by any margin of preparation, but by a few days of orbital timing, and almost no one alive even noticed it happen. There is one more storm worth pulling out of the archive because it shows just how strange and far-reaching the reach of the sun can be, in ways nobody would ever guess. In August of 1972, in the middle of a powerful solar storm, something happened off the coast of Vietnam that stayed classified for decades. The United States had seeded the waters near Haiphong Harbour with sea mines designed to detonate when they sensed the magnetic disturbance of a passing ship's steel hull. During that solar storm, the magnetic field of the Earth itself shuddered hard enough that dozens of those mines suddenly detonated on their own, all at once, with no ship anywhere near them, blown up by nothing but the current from the sky reaching down and tripping their sensors. Navy crews watching from a distance saw the water erupt in a line of unexplained explosions. It took years to work out that the sun had swept the minefield. If you ever needed proof that these storms reach into the physical world in concrete, violent, and utterly unexpected ways, there it is, written in seawater and high explosive. I bring that up not as a curiosity but as a warning about imagination. The failures we can picture, the blackouts and the dead transformers, are only the ones we have thought to look for. A storm large enough finds its way into systems we never connected the sun to at all, the way it found those mines, and the modern world is stitched through with far more magnetic and electronic nervous tissue than the world of 1972 ever was. The current from the sky does not politely limit itself to the effects we have planned for. And here is the part that should keep you in your seat, because it is where the two halves of this story finally close around each other. The grid that got lucky in 2024, the grid that would have to absorb the next Carrington whenever the geometry finally lines up, is not getting stronger between now and then. It is getting older and more loaded and more fragile every single year. The machines that survived the last storm are a little more worn for the next one. And when you understand just how much more brittle the grid has become, and how much more we have piled onto it in only the last few years, you start to realize that the storm of 2024 may have been the last big one the grid was young enough and light enough to survive. Part 8. The Aging Giants. Here is the uncomfortable truth that turns this from a story about the sun into a story about us. The grid that shrugged off the storm of 2024 is not the grid that will face the next big one, because it is aging out from under us, and the parts that are aging fastest are the very parts a solar storm attacks. Go back to the grey box on the edge of town and now ask a simple question we skipped earlier. How old is it? For a great many of the largest transformers holding up the system, the answer is somewhere around 40 years, and for plenty of them, more than that. These machines were built for a working life of perhaps 40 years, and a large share of the fleet is now operating at or beyond that mark, running on borrowed time, kept alive by maintenance and hope. We are, in a real sense, running the most critical machinery of the modern world well past its retirement age, because replacing it is so slow and so expensive that utilities keep nursing the old giants along rather than swapping them out. Now connect that to the mechanism from Part 5, because this is where the age becomes dangerous rather than merely inconvenient. Remember what actually kills a transformer in a solar storm. The saturated core spills its magnetic field into the surrounding metal, and that stray field heats the insulation and the windings until they cook. Whether the machine survives that assault depends entirely on how much margin it has, how much extra thermal room, how much healthy insulation, how much slack between its normal operating state and its breaking point. And that margin is precisely what age eats away. An old transformer has insulation that has already spent decades slowly degrading, breaking down under years of heat and electrical stress. It has less room to spare, a thinner cushion between a hard day and a fatal one. So the same jolt of current from the sky that a young, healthy transformer might have absorbed with room to spare can be exactly enough to push an old, worn one over the edge. The sun did not get stronger. The targets got weaker. And even if we wanted to fix this tomorrow, we run headlong into the wall I described earlier, the wall that is really the centre of this entire story, the replacement bottleneck. Let me put the full weight of it in front of you now. Each of these large transformers is custom built for its exact location. Each weighs between 100 and 400 tons. Each costs millions of dollars. For decades, the majority of them have been built overseas and shipped in, which means the lead time to get a new one, from order to installation, runs roughly 12 to 24 months, a year to 2 years, in the best of circumstances. They are so heavy that moving them requires specialized railcars that exist only in tiny numbers, and they cannot be mass-produced or stockpiled in any meaningful quantity, because each is nearly one of a kind, made to order for the spot it will live in. Sit with what that means in a crisis. On an ordinary day, if one transformer fails, the grid reroutes around it and a replacement is ordered, and the year-long wait is an accounting problem, not an emergency, because the lights stay on in the meantime. But a severe, wide-area solar storm does not damage one transformer. It could damage many, across a whole region, in the same afternoon, all of them the same irreplaceable giants, all needing replacement at once. And there is no reroute around a hole that big, and there is no warehouse of spares, and there is no factory that can suddenly build hundreds of custom, 100-ton machines out of turn. Everyone stands in the same line, and the line is measured in years. The redundancy that saves us on a normal day, the ability to lean on a neighbour, quietly disappears the moment the damage is broad enough that every neighbour is wounded too. There are efforts to soften this, and honesty requires me to mention them. The industry has built spare transformer sharing programs, small pools of emergency units that utilities agree to share in a disaster. But those pools cover only a fraction of what a truly severe storm could take out, and they were never designed for a continent-scale event. There are engineering fixes too, devices that can block the current from the sky at the transformer's grounded connection, and they work. But installing them across thousands of substations costs money and takes years, and the rollout has been slow and patchy. We know how to reduce this risk. We have simply not, as a civilization, decided to spend what it would take to do it at the scale and speed the threat deserves. Let me put a sharper point on why these giants are allowed to grow so old, because it is not exactly negligence, it is economics, and the economics are their own kind of trap. Replacing a large transformer that is still working purely to guard against a storm that might not come this decade is enormously expensive and very hard to justify to the regulators who set what customers pay, so utilities do the rational short-term thing. They nurse the old machines along, inspect them, patch them, and squeeze a few more years out of them, because the one running today is already paid for and the replacement is millions of dollars and 2 years away. Multiply that one reasonable decision across thousands of machines and hundreds of utilities and decades of time, and you arrive, one sensible choice at a time, at a continental grid propped up by giants that are collectively older than they have ever been. Nobody set out to build a fragile grid. We aged into it, prudently, one deferred replacement at a time. There is genuinely good news buried in here, and honesty requires me to hand it to you because this is a solvable problem, and that is exactly what makes the slowness so maddening. We know how to protect these transformers. There are devices, blocking devices, that can be fitted at a transformer's grounded connection to stop the current from the sky from ever entering it, to slam the door the storm comes through. They work. There are operating procedures that let grid controllers brace the system when a storm is forecast. There are reliability standards, already on the books, that require utilities to study their exposure to a benchmark storm. The engineering is not the obstacle. The obstacle is money and will and time, the cost of installing those blockers across thousands of substations, the slow grind of turning a standard written on paper into hardware bolted into the ground. We are not waiting on a scientific breakthrough here. We are waiting on ourselves. And the spare transformer programs meant to be our safety net, those small shared pools of emergency units that utilities can draw on in a crisis, were built for ordinary failures, 1 or 2 machines at a time, not for a storm that could destroy dozens or hundreds across an entire region in a single afternoon. Against a truly severe event, those pools are a bucket raised against a flood. They help, and they are far better than nothing, but they were never sized for the thing we actually lie awake fearing. There is a further vulnerability hiding inside that import statistic, and it is worth saying plainly because it turns a supply problem into something closer to a strategic one. For most of the last century, the United States built its own large transformers, at home, in its own factories. That capacity has largely moved overseas. Today the majority of these giants are made by a small number of specialized plants in other countries, which means that in the aftermath of a great storm, we would not simply be standing in a long line. We would be standing in a long line at someone else's factory, waiting for a machine we can no longer readily build for ourselves, wound from specialized electrical steel and precision copper that also come from tight global supply chains. You cannot conjure that capacity overnight. You cannot ask a plant that builds a few dozen of these a year to suddenly turn out a few thousand. The raw materials, the skilled hands, the specialized tooling, none of it scales on the timescale of an emergency. And notice what that means for a country's basic independence. A nation that cannot manufacture the backbone of its own power grid is, in a real sense, dependent on the rest of the world to put its lights back on after a disaster, at the very moment the rest of the world is scrambling to save its own. This is not a worry that lives only in space weather circles. It has been flagged for years in national security reviews as a genuine weakness. The plain recognition that the machines holding up modern life are old, few, slow to replace, and largely built somewhere else. We have, without ever quite deciding to, turned the most critical hardware of our civilization into something we can neither quickly replace nor easily produce ourselves. So the picture of the target has now come fully into focus, and it is worse than we left it. It is not just that the grid is enormous and interconnected and irreplaceable, though it is all of those things. It is that the giants holding it up are old, worn thin, past their design lives, running on borrowed margin, and backed by a replacement queue measured in years for machines measured in tons. The current from the sky is aimed at the most fragile version of the grid that has ever existed. And yet, incredibly, age is only half of the reason the grid has never been more exposed, because at the very same moment those old machines are growing weaker, we have begun asking them to carry more than any grid in history has ever been asked to carry, and the reason why is sitting in your pocket, cooling a building the size of a town, and baking half a continent under a heat dome right now. Part 9. The load we keep piling on. The reason the grid has never been more loaded is sitting in your pocket, humming inside a building the size of a small town, and baking half a continent under a heat dome as I speak. Start with the heat, because it is happening right now, on the very day we are talking. Across the southern tier of the United States, a major heat wave is building, the kind that pushes the temperature toward records and, more importantly for our story, pushes electricity demand toward records right along with it. Air conditioning is the single largest swing in demand the grid ever sees. When a heat dome settles over tens of millions of people, every one of those air conditioners kicks on and stays on day and night, and the grid strains to feed them all. On the hottest afternoons, the whole system runs flat out, every transformer working near its limit, every line carrying nearly all it can hold. And as the world grows warmer, and these heat waves grow longer and more frequent, those maximum demand days come more often. The grid spends more and more of its life running with no room to spare. Now stack the second thing on top, the newest thing, the one that has genuinely reshaped grid planning in just the last few years. We have entered the age of the data center, the enormous warehouse of computers that runs the cloud, and increasingly, the artificial intelligence that everyone is racing to build. These facilities are not like ordinary buildings. A single large data center campus can draw as much electricity as a small city, and unlike air conditioning, it does not switch off at night. It runs at full power around the clock, every hour of every day, a constant, heavy, relentless draw that simply did not exist at this scale even a handful of years ago. We are building them as fast as we can pour the concrete, and each one is another permanent, immovable weight hung on a grid that was already straining. Add to that the electric cars charging in more driveways every month, the electric heat pumps replacing furnaces, the general electrification of everything, and you have demand climbing on every front at once. Here is why all of that matters for a solar storm, and it is the connection people almost always miss. Remember what a saturated transformer does to the grid during a storm. It suddenly gulps enormous amounts of reactive power and drags the voltage down across the network. Whether the grid can survive, that depends on whether it has any margin left, any spare capacity to prop the voltage back up and absorb the shock. A grid running lightly on a mild day has that cushion. It can take the hit, sag, and recover. But a grid already running flat out, every machine near its limit to feed a heat wave and 1,000 data centers, has no cushion left to give. When the storm's demand lands on a system that is already maxed, there is nothing in reserve to catch it. The same storm that a lightly loaded grid might ride out can shove an already straining grid straight over the edge into collapse. A busy grid is a brittle grid, and the timing of this could hardly be crueler, because the sun does not wait for a quiet Tuesday in the spring when demand is low. A solar storm can arrive on the hottest afternoon of the year, when the grid is already gasping, when every transformer is already hot and working at its limit, when there is the least possible room to absorb one more shock. The heat that maxes out the grid and the storm that attacks it are not coordinated in our favour. They can and eventually will arrive together, the worst possible current from the sky landing on the worst possible day for the grid to receive it. There is one more feature of the modern grid that turns a local failure into a regional one, and I mentioned it briefly before, but it deserves a moment here. The grid is highly interconnected deliberately, because sharing power between regions makes the whole thing more efficient and more reliable on ordinary days. But that same web of connections is the pathway along which a cascade travels. We have seen this even without the sun. The great blackout that darkened the northeastern United States and part of Canada in the summer of 2003 was not caused by a solar storm at all. It began with a few overgrown trees and a software failure. But it showed the world how a modern interconnected grid behaves once the cascade starts. How a local problem can unzip across an entire region in minutes as protective devices trip in sequence and dump their loads onto one another. The interconnection that shares our strength on a good day shares our failure on a bad one. So bring the two halves of the target together and hold them side by side, because this is the whole reason the title of this is not an exaggeration. On one side, the giants that hold up the grid are old, worn thin, past their design lives, and backed by a replacement queue measured in years. On the other side, we are loading that aging system harder than any grid in history has ever been loaded, with heat waves and data centers and electrification all climbing at once, burning away the very margin that would let it survive a shock. Older machines, heavier loads, thinner cushion. That is what more fragile than it has been in decades actually means, in concrete terms. It is not a feeling. It is the physical state of the machine your life depends on. Let me make the connection between a busy grid and a fragile one as concrete as I can, because it is the hinge of why the modern grid is so much more exposed than the ones that rode out earlier storms. Picture the grid's ability to hold its voltage steady as a bank account of reserve power, a cushion it draws on to keep everything balanced when something goes wrong. On a quiet, mild day, that account is comfortably full, and when a disturbance comes along and demands a sudden withdrawal, the grid simply pays it and carries on without a flicker. But on the hottest afternoon of a heat wave, with every air conditioner in a region running flat out and every transformer already near its limit, that account is nearly drained just to keep the lights on and the buildings cool. There is almost nothing left in reserve. So when the current from the sky arrives and the saturated transformers suddenly demand an enormous withdrawal all at once, the account goes empty, the voltage collapses, and the protective devices begin to trip. The very same storm that a well-rested grid could have absorbed with room to spare shoves an exhausted grid straight over the edge. Fragility is not only about the age of the machines, it is about a system with no slack left in it, and we have spent years steadily wringing the slack out. The data centers make this worse in a way that is genuinely new to this decade. Unlike a heat wave which comes and goes with the weather, the enormous draw of these computing warehouses never eases off. It is there at 3 in the afternoon in July, and it is there at 4 in the morning in January, a permanent floor under the demand curve that only keeps rising as we build more of them to feed the world's growing hunger for cloud storage and artificial intelligence. A single one of the largest campuses can pull as much power as a small city, continuously, forever. And they are only one part of a broader wave, the electric cars filling more driveways every month, the electric heat pumps replacing furnaces, the steady electrification of everything we do. We are, in effect, raising the water level in the reservoir at the very moment we are asking the dam to survive a larger flood. Every new load we connect is another permanent claim on the reserve that would otherwise be there to catch a storm. And the timing, I cannot stress this enough, does not break in our favour because the sun does not consult our demand forecast before it fires. A severe storm is perfectly capable of arriving on the single hottest, most heavily loaded afternoon of the year, precisely when the grid has the least possible margin to give, when every machine is already hot and every line is already full. The worst storm and the worst possible day for it to land are not held apart by any law of nature. They can arrive together, and given enough years, they eventually will. Step back and look at the trend line, because it runs the wrong way on every axis at once. Year after year, we ask the grid to carry more, as the heat waves lengthen and the data centers multiply, and everything that used to burn fuel switches over to drawing current instead. Year after year, the giants that carry that load grow a little older, a little more worn, a little further past the age they were built to reach. The demand climbs while the health of the machines declines, the two lines crossing like a pair of scissors slowly closing, and the gap between them, the margin that would let the system survive a shock, narrows a little more with every summer that goes by. Nothing about that trend is being reversed at the moment. We are not building the spares fast enough, not fitting the protections fast enough, not replacing the old giants fast enough to keep pace with what we keep asking them to do. The grid is growing thirstier and older at the same time, and the sky above it has not changed its habits in the slightest. And above it all, the sun keeps firing. So let us finally do the thing nobody enjoys doing, the thing this entire story has been building toward. Let us stop talking about the trigger and the target separately and walk through the day they meet. Let us follow, minute by minute, what actually happens when a storm the size of the one frozen in the Greenland ice arrives, correctly aimed, over the oldest and most heavily loaded grid we have ever built, because it is only when you see the whole sequence run to its end that you understand why the people who study this do not lie awake, worrying about the lights flickering. They lie awake worrying about something much larger and much harder to switch back on. Part 10. The day the aim is true. So, let us walk through it, minute by minute, the day the geometry finally lines up. not to frighten you for its own sake, but because you cannot weigh a risk you refuse to look at directly. Picture a summer afternoon, the grid already running hard under a heat dome, when a coronal mass ejection the size of the Carrington monster leaves the Sun aimed squarely at Earth, its magnetic field turned in the orientation that couples most violently to our own. We see it launch. Telescopes catch the cloud blasting outward, and for a day or two, as it crosses the gulf between the Sun and us, we know something enormous is coming, though we cannot yet be certain how bad. Then it arrives, and the planet's magnetic field convulses harder than it has in 150 years, and the current from the sky pours into the grid, into those old and overloaded giants, all across the continent at once. What follows next happens faster than any human hand can stop it. The largest transformers drive into saturation, their cores flooding, their stray fields heating the metal within. They begin gulping reactive power in unison, and the voltage sags across whole regions at once. The harmonics pour into the lines, and the protective devices, thousands of them, begin to see conditions they were built to flee from, and they trip. And as each one trips, it dumps its load onto its neighbours, and the cascade races outward along the interconnections, region feeding into region, exactly as it did in Quebec in 90 seconds. Except now it is not one province. It is a substantial fraction of a continent going dark between one breath and the next. And here is the difference that changes everything. The difference between this and every ordinary blackout you have ever lived through. In a normal outage, the equipment is fine. The power was interrupted, but the machines are healthy, so crews find the fault, fix it, and switch the system back on within hours or days. On the day the aim is true, that is not the situation, because many of the largest transformers are not merely switched off. They are cooked. They are physically destroyed, their windings melted, their insulation charred, ruined from the inside by the heat of the saturated cores. You cannot switch a dead transformer back on, and the machines that would replace them are the custom-built, 100-ton, million-dollar giants with the 2-year backorder. The thing that would restore the power has itself been destroyed, in large numbers, all at once. That is the nightmare, stated plainly. Not a blackout you wait out. A blackout you cannot quickly end, because the tools to end it are gone. Now let the consequences ripple outward, because electricity is not one system among many. It is the master system that every other system rides on, and when it goes, it takes the others with it in an order that is grimly predictable. The water goes first for many, because modern cities run on electric pumps that push water up into towers and through pipes, and when the pumps stop, the taps run for only as long as gravity and pressure hold, often a matter of hours to a day. Fuel goes next, because the pumps at every gas station run on electricity, and the refineries and pipelines that make and move that fuel run on electricity too. So the generators people count on cannot be refilled, and the trucks that resupply everything cannot be fueled. Communications fade as the batteries at the cell towers drain over a few hours and are never recharged. Refrigeration fails, and with it the food in every store and the medicine in every pharmacy and hospital. The payment systems, the machines, the just-in-time supply chains that keep only about 3 days of food inside any given city, all of it depends on the power, and the power is not coming back next week. I want to be careful and honest here, because this channel does not deal in doom for its own sake. This is not the end of the world, and it is not the end of civilization. Human beings are resourceful, and communities are tougher than they look, and much of the country would still have power, because a storm does not destroy every transformer everywhere. But the serious modelling of this scenario, including a well-known study from the National Academies back in 2008, put the first-year cost of a Carrington-class strike on a modern grid at somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion, and estimated that full recovery could take anywhere from 4 to 10 years, precisely because of the transformer bottleneck. 4 to 10 years is not a power cut. It is an era. It is a wide-area, long-duration blackout in a society that has almost no living memory of what that means, and almost no practice at surviving it. And before you file this away as the kind of thing that happens once in 1,000 years and can safely be ignored, look at the number the researchers actually attached to it. One widely cited analysis estimated the odds of a Carrington-class storm hitting Earth at roughly 12% per decade. 12% per decade. That is not a freak once-and-forever accident. That is closer to a coin that comes up disaster a bit more than once a century, which means that over a human lifetime, the odds are not comfortably small at all. We are not talking about whether this is possible. We established it is possible because it happened, and the proof is in the ice. We are talking about something with real, calculable odds aimed at the most fragile grid we have ever built, by a star that fired an X-flare into the sky last night. I want to translate 4 to 10 years out of the language of economic modelling and into something you can actually feel, because a number that large has a way of going abstract on us. A blackout you recover from in 3 days is an ordeal, a story you tell for years, a blackout that stretches into months and, in the hardest hit regions, into years, is something modern society has quite simply never experienced and is not built to endure. It would mean the slow unwinding of the single assumption underneath every part of daily life, the assumption that you flip a switch and the power is there. It would mean triage on a scale we normally associate with wartime, hauling the few spare transformers we do have to the places that keep the most people alive first, the hospitals, the water plants, the fuel terminals, and asking everywhere else to wait its turn in a line measured in seasons. It would test whether a society that has forgotten how to function without the machine can relearn it fast enough. The people who plan for this at the national level do not call it the end of the world, and neither will I, because human beings are tougher and more resourceful than the darkest scenarios allow for. But they call it a generational setback, a body blow, and every one of them will tell you the limiting factor, the thing that turns weeks into years, is the same grey box we started with, and how few of them we can build, and how slowly. None of this is science fiction, and that is the part I most need you to carry out of here with you. This is not a doomsday fantasy dreamed up to frighten you into watching. It is the sober, footnoted assessment of national academies, insurance markets, grid regulators, and the engineers who actually run the system, written up in careful reports and then quietly filed under the heading of risks we have chosen so far to underinvest in. The storm is real, the mechanism is proven, the odds are calculable, and the vulnerability is sitting in the ground beneath us right now, humming to itself behind its chain-link fence, waiting to find out whether the next big cloud is pointed at us or just past us. And it is not only the physical necessities that unravel. Think for a moment about how much of modern life is now purely electronic, held together by nothing but power and signal. The money in your accounts is a set of numbers on a server somewhere, and the card readers and cash machines that let you reach it all run on electricity. So in a long, wide blackout, the economy does not merely slow, it seizes, because the ordinary act of buying and selling depends on systems that have gone dark. The internet, the thing every one of us would instinctively reach for to find out what is happening and to tell the people we love that we are all right, fades within hours as the backup batteries at the cell towers and the data centers drain and are never refilled. And so a population that has never in its life been out of contact for more than a moment finds itself, all at once, unable to call, unable to search, unable to know anything beyond what it can see with its own 2 eyes. We have almost no practice at that kind of silence, and it is its own distinct hardship, separate from the cold and the thirst, the sudden severing of a nervous system we never realized we'd grown into. None of this happens because the world has ended. It happens because one master system, the electricity, quietly withdraws, and every other system we layered on top of it over the last 100 years goes down in sequence, like a row of dominoes we spent a century carefully standing on end. That is why last night mattered. Not because last night was the day, it was not. The aim was off and the storm is fading. Last night mattered because it was the sun clearing its throat. It was a reminder, one more in a long series, that the chamber is still loaded, that the star still has the shot, and that the only thing standing between an ordinary summer and the day the aim is true is the geometry of where the next cloud happens to point. And there is one last thing standing in that gap, one final thin line of defense between us and the transformers, cooking in the dark, and I need to tell you about it, because it is real, and because it is smaller than almost anyone realizes. Part 11. The 15 minutes that save us. The last line of defense between us and the transformers cooking in the dark is not a wall or a shield. It is a warning, and it is measured in minutes, and there are fewer of them than you would ever guess. Here is the strange, frustrating shape of what we can and cannot see. When one of those clouds of plasma leaves the sun aimed at us, we do get a heads up that something is coming. Telescopes watching the sun's outer atmosphere catch the eruption blasting outward, and from its speed we can estimate, roughly, that it will arrive in something like 1 to 3 days. So in the broadest sense, we are not blind. We can see the punch being thrown from across the room, but there is one detail we cannot measure from a distance, and it happens to be the single detail that decides whether the storm is a light show or a catastrophe. That detail is the direction the cloud's own magnetic field is pointing. If it arrives pointing the same way as Earth's field, the two slide past each other and little happens. If it arrives pointing opposite, pointing south, it locks onto our field and tears at it, and that is the storm that drives the current from the sky into the grid, and we cannot know which it will be until the cloud is almost on top of us. The only place we reliably measure that magnetic orientation is a spot called L1, about 1.5 million kilometers from Earth in the direction of the Sun, where a small fleet of spacecraft sits and waits, watching the solar winds stream past. When the cloud reaches those spacecraft, they read its magnetic field and radio the answer to Earth. But by then the cloud is only about 1.5 million kilometers away, closing at over 1 million miles an hour, which means the warning those far-off sensors give us, the gap between the moment we finally know how bad it is and the moment it strikes the grid, is not days and it is not hours. It is roughly 15 to 60 minutes. Everything a grid operator could possibly do to save the machines has to happen inside that window, that thin sliver of time between the alarm and the impact. And this, right here, is the place to clear up one of the most common suspicions about this whole subject, because understanding the truth of it actually makes you less afraid, not more. People sometimes say that the authorities will deliberately shut off the power and blame the sun, as though a solar blackout were a cover story for something sinister. But once you understand the 15 minutes, you see what is really going on. In that short window, the smartest thing an operator can do is deliberately reduce the load on the grid, take some transformers offline on purpose, disconnect the most vulnerable machines, and brace the system, precisely so that a controlled, temporary reduction can prevent an uncontrolled, permanent destruction. That is not a conspiracy. That is the fire drill. A planned, brief blackout that saves the irreplaceable giants is 1,000 times better than a cascade that cooks them. And if it ever happens to you, it will not be a plot against you. It will be the system trying to survive so that it can come back on in hours instead of years. The real danger was never that they would turn it off on purpose. The real danger is that the storm turns it off first before anyone can act. Now, while the grid is the part that could hurt us most, it is not the only thing the current from the sky reaches, and the other effects are worth knowing, because they are the same storm wearing different faces. The most beautiful face is the aurora itself, the northern and southern lights, and it is worth pausing on the strange truth that the glowing curtains people drive for miles to photograph are made by the very same shuddering of the magnetic field that drives the destroying current into the transformers. The beauty and the threat are not two different things. They are one thing seen from two directions. The same storm also scrambles the satellite navigation signals we have quietly woven into everything, the precise timing and positioning that guides not just phones but tractors, aircraft, shipping, and even the clocks that stamp financial transactions, which is why a strong storm can knock the guidance out of a farmer's tractor in the middle of planting. It heats and swells the upper atmosphere, which reaches up and drags on the thousands of satellites in low orbit, and in past storms that added drag has pulled batches of newly launched satellites back down to burn up before they ever reach their orbits. And it blacks out the high-frequency radio that aviation and shipping still rely on over the poles and the oceans, which is the R-scale blackout that washed over the daylight side of Earth just last night. Every one of these, the lights, the lost navigation, the dragged-down satellites, the dead radio, is the same shudder of the same field, the same current from the same sky, and the transformers are simply the target where that current does its most lasting harm. I should be equally honest about the other stories that circulate, because this channel measures them against the evidence rather than either swallowing them whole or waving them away. There is a persistent belief that governments are secretly hardening everything and hiding the true risk, and the reality is almost the opposite of a cover-up. There genuinely are national strategies and mandatory reliability standards, and past commissions on exactly this threat, some dating back about a decade, but they are underfunded, uneven, and slow relative to how fast the danger is growing. The problem is not a well-run secret. The problem is a poorly funded truth sitting in plain sight that most people never hear about. There is also a recurring claim that solar storms trigger earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, and here the honest answer is that the proposed link is weak, inconsistent, and not accepted by the scientists who study the ground. So while it is worth mentioning, it does not hold up, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The story is frightening enough where it is actually true. It does not need to be inflated where it is not. So we arrive, finally, at the question underneath all of it, the one that does not have a comfortable answer. We cannot control when the sun fires, because it fires on its own schedule, loaded with tangled regions that do not care about our calendar. We cannot control where it aims, because that is decided by the blind rotation of a star, the accident of which way a sunspot happens to be facing on the day it lets go. We cannot even see the shot clearly until it is 15 minutes from landing. The only thing, the one thing, that is genuinely within our power is how much the shot would cost us when it finally connects, and that is entirely a matter of whether we harden the grid, fix the transformer bottleneck, and build the spares before the geometry lines up, or whether we keep nursing the aging giants along and hoping the ball keeps landing on a lucky number. That is the whole choice. Everything else is up to the sun. And there is a version of this story that ends well, which is the part the fear can make us forget. We are not helpless in front of the sun. We cannot stop it from firing, but we can make ourselves ready to be hit, and readiness is entirely a choice we get to make in the calm years, long before the alarm ever sounds. We can install the blocking devices on the transformers most exposed to the current from the sky. We can build and stockpile spare giants, so the 2-year line becomes a 2-month one. We can bring the manufacturing of these machines closer to home, so we are not waiting on a factory an ocean away while our cities sit dark. We can fund the monitoring, tighten the standards, and run the drills, so that when the 15 minutes finally come, the people at the controls know exactly what to do with them. Every one of these is achievable. Not one of them requires a miracle. They require only that we take the quiet hum behind the fence as seriously as we take the fire in the sky, and that we do the work before the storm, not after. That is the entire difference between a hard week and a lost decade, and it is the one part of this whole story that is ours to write. I should be honest about one more thing, because it is the reason we cannot simply lean on our neighbours the way we do in an ordinary disaster. A storm like the one frozen in the Greenland ice would not strike a single country. It would wash over the entire daylight side of the planet and the whole high-latitude world at once, which means every wired nation would be in the same crisis at the same moment, all of them reaching for the same scarce spare transformers, all of them placing orders at the same small handful of factories, all of them standing in one line that suddenly stretches around the world. In the blackout that follows a great solar storm, there is no cavalry riding in from the next country over, because the next country over is dark too. We would be, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely on our own, with a problem we had years of warning to prevent and chose not to. That, more than any number, is what the specialists are really afraid of. And the sun, as it demonstrated last night, is not finished. It fired an X-flare and a dozen more behind it, threw a blackout across the daylight side of the planet, and drove a storm that rang the magnetic field like a bell, all while it is supposedly winding down toward its quiet years. The clouds it launched this time are aimed a little to the side, and the storm is already fading, and we will walk out into tomorrow with the lights still on, and almost no one will know how close the machinery of their lives sits to the edge of a star's temper. But the regions rotating off the western edge of the sun tonight are not gone. They are only turned away, and stars, unlike people, always come back around. One day, on a day we cannot predict, a region like the ones firing right now will be facing us squarely when it lets go, and it will hurl a cloud pointed the wrong way down the 93 million miles between us, and it will arrive over a grid that is older and more loaded than it has ever been, with 15 minutes of warning and a 2-year wait for the parts. Whether that day is a long blackout we recover from, or a catastrophe we remember for generations, will not be decided in that moment. It will have already been decided years earlier by whether we chose to take the fragile machine seriously while the sky was still calm. The sun will keep firing. It always has. The only real question that has ever been asked to answer is whether we will still be listening on the night it finally aims true.